Are you happy to? Okay. I probably won't use it in the answer list there, which I think is. Codings kanske lite.
Recording in progress.
Okay. نجربها لكن نجرب
سوي
ولا نبدأ فيها؟
سوي شو اسمه سلايد شو not PowerPoint سلايد شو اوكي شو
لا لا لا
سيف سوي الشاشة هذه شو مشكلة
الشاشة سكرها أحسن.
سكر سكر لي السلايد شو شغل الحين ادخل كل شيء صوتي شغال على كل
شيل ميوته.
خلاص شير ميوت شيء تحس فرق ميت ممكن تفتحه من تلفونك لينك ما عندك اياه انت ما عندكم اياه في الايميل ما مسكر ما مسكر لينك في الايميل language start سؤال لا صح يا سافر واضح
Okay, thank you. For me, it's done it.
Sure.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Hopefully, you can hear me. I'd like to welcome you to the Launchpad session today, called Change Management. Before I do that, though, I'd just like to introduce myself. I am Kevin Rees, originally from the UK. I have a military background. I spent 16 years in the British Army and then went on to the Air Force, the Royal Air Force, and then spent a further 13 years on service with them. The last 4 years of which was on loan service in Oman with the Royal Air Force of Oman. So I had a great introduction to this fantastic country, and I've been back and forth ever since then because you can't keep me away. You can never get too much of a good thing, is what they say. So throughout my military career and since I retired in 2012, I've been bombarded with change activities, or either involved in change, leading change, or being dragged into change. And we'll talk more about the different attitudes to change as we go through this particular presentation today. If you do have any questions, please put it into the chat. I'm not 100% sure how I'm going to see it, but my colleagues outside the room will be able to guide me and help me with that for sure. So let's get off with the session then. So I've got some sort of things for you to ponder and think about. Feel free to put your responses into the chat if you wish, but it's more really for a reflection. So when we talk about change management, I'd like to ask you, are you actually involved in change at the moment? And if so, what challenges are you finding with this change? So I'll just give you a moment to think about that. If you want to put anything in the chat, please feel free, and then we'll pick that up, and then we can move forward to the slides. So are you involved in change at the moment? And what challenges are you currently finding with this change? Personally, while you're reflecting on that, I'll talk about my change. I reflect on change quite a lot because when you sit back and think about it, it's amazing how many things we go through in our lives that are related to change. That could be changing ourselves. And a good example of that is when I go home to see my mother. I very rarely go down to South Wales, where I'm from, to see my parents. But when I do, the first thing my mother tells me is how much weight I put on, or hopefully how much weight I've lost. It's normally the first, tell me how much weight I put on. But it's the reason for that is that she hasn't seen me change over a period of time. And the differences between when she saw me last and when she saw me this time are quite remarkable. Whereas myself, I'm changing on a daily basis, and I don't notice those minor little changes that are happening to me. It's only when I get that reflection by getting feedback from somebody that I realise that I've gone through a change process myself. And that's what happens to us individually, but also within the work environment, within our social lives, change is continually happening to us. So I'm sure there are plenty of things you can think about, both personal and work-related, that relate to change, and consider the challenges that you're going through with that change yourselves. So today then, we're going to cover quite a few little bits and pieces around change. Going to focus more at the strategic level today and look at leading change rather than managing change to a certain extent, and look at a whole range of different models. Some of them are very popular, some of them are used by many organizations, some of them less so. And I think talking through a range of theories and models will help you to understand the different aspects of change and managing or leading change as a result. Prior to that, we'll look a little bit around strategy and the importance of considering strategy as part of change, often the driver for change, but not always the case. And then to wrap up, I've got a little case study of a change that I'm helping an organization with at the moment. Even though this is related to safety specifically, it does have huge opportunities to see change in an organization. And the impact of the change through this project related to safety has an impact on all areas of the business. So the change is quite important. And I think it's a very good little case study to look at to bring things together. So, click the slides to work. Okay. So why is change management important? And actually, what is it? Well, any change really is a change from one state to another state. So we're changing from something that we know to something that we don't know. That change is normally driven by a vision or a dream or a strategy or an objective, something that forces us to change or makes us think about the change. So it's going from the current state to the future state, and the process we go through is the change. Okay, so we're changing from one state to another. Excuse me. And it's the management of that process is what change management is all about. So all the input we have between our current state and our future state, that process needs to be managed or needs to be led. And that is done through a change management process. Now, this change process from one state to another state can be quite turbulent and quite stressful. And normally the biggest reason why change is unsuccessful is because this gets too heavy or gets too much, or we don't put enough management focus or enough leadership focus on the change that we're going through. Some recent research by the Harvard Business School identified that over 50% of change initiatives in large organizations, and we're talking about the top organizations in the world, fail, or they don't achieve the end of the result that they set out to achieve. So there is some difference in terms of what their future state will be, and not what people actually envisaged. That's quite important to reflect on, because obviously we're not very good at change, is what that's telling me. And we need to be better at identifying the key reasons why change fails, so we can put things in place to prevent that happening to us. So the key thing is to reflect on the future state and the journey we need to take from our current state to achieve that future state that we're aiming for. There is a good way to consider the different aspects of change management, and to provide a focus on what we need to think about when we're preparing for change. So it's called the 4Ps model, and it stands for project. So list all your future and current projects. So what really are we focusing on in terms of the change? Now, change can be made up of a single project or multiple projects in a program that drive us towards our end result. A complex change often requires lots of little projects that build up into a bigger project that ultimately deliver the change that we want. So really envisaging what you have ahead of you, what are you set to do, is really what this project is trying to achieve. The next one is purpose. There must be a benefit to change, hopefully a positive benefit. Sometimes when change is enforced on us, that may not be the case. But really, we're looking for the change to result in something that's better than we currently have. So the future state will be more positive. The future state will be better than the current state that we have today. So particulars is the third P. So particulars is really, what do we need to change? What needs to be different from our current state to our future state? And be quite specific about what those are, because that's really what helps you to plan and to prioritize what your change should be. And the final part, and I think is probably the most important part, is the people. Who are going to be affected by this change? And it's very easy to think about people within inside a team or within a department or sometimes in an organization, but very often in organizations, it's the stakeholders outside of the organization which are equally affected. So it's really important to identify every single person or every single group of people that are going to be affected by the change, and develop a strategy on how you're going to manage each of those different groups of people, because all their effect on them by change will be different. So the 4P model is quite useful just to frame the approach you're going to take. And it's normally done before you start a change journey, and it helps you to shape and vision exactly where you want to go with it, what are the benefits you want to achieve, and then who is going to be affected by that. Success in change, as I said, is very difficult to achieve. And I said around 50% of organizations fail at their change initiatives. And these are some of the key attributes that we need to focus on from an organizational perspective that really will help us to be more successful in change. The value systems and culture within an organization, and every organization has a different culture, is going to be either receptive or resistant to change. And this adaptability to change is something we need to be fully aware of. If we have a value system and culture which is well ingrained and has been slow changing over a period of time, it's likely that any new change won't be rapidly accepted, and our ability to change will be limited. So we may need to affect that by looking at our value system, looking at our culture, and trying to identify what we can do to improve or to make a change in that will allow us to make the change program more effective and more successful. Capacity for change is a big topic as well. So how much capacity do people have to change? In the modern workplace, we're all very, very busy. I'm sure most of us are answering emails at very late at night or very early in the morning. We're very much connected these days in the world of work, and it's very, very difficult to switch off. Very, very difficult to really get that work-life balance, and that indicates to me that we're really very busy people and very capacity full. and find it very, very difficult to find capacity to do something different. So in an organization, we need to create that capacity for change. If we don't create that capacity for change, it is just another task on top of a busy workload that people will have to deal with. And therefore, you're competing with priorities of other work that people have to do against the change program. That is fine if people are very proactive with change and driving for change. But if people are a little bit resistant or a little bit impartial to change, then your project, your change initiative is unlikely to be a priority for those individuals. Another key aspect to think about is leadership styles and power distribution. Power distribution is really about stakeholder management and stakeholder engagement, and who has control, who is ultimately the person that we need to engage, who ultimately is the person that's going to sign off on the success of the project, who are the real key stakeholders in what we're trying to do in terms of change. Our leadership styles will need to be varied and need to be appropriate to the change program that we're putting in place. That also needs to link to our capacity to change and our value systems and culture we talked about earlier on. All of these things are necessary to be linked and to coordinate to be successful. A typical leadership style could be very democratic, very autocratic, could be very supportive, very coaching. Whatever style works for the work that you do today may not be the style you need to see the project through to success. So that's something that needs to be considered as well. Now, as I said, we're all going through change, whether we realize it or not. And that reflective question I posed at the start really makes us understand that we're all exposed to lots of different types of change almost on a daily basis. And if organizations have gone through a significant change program in the past, a fairly recent past probably, that may not be something that we can park and move on to the next change. It comes with what we call baggage, particularly if the previous change projects weren't successful or didn't deliver the benefits that people were expecting. That will then have a negative impact, negative connotation, and cloud people's perspective and cloud people's commitment to future change projects. Also linked with this is a rapid change process where you have organizations who currently are going through a change program. Before they realize the benefits of that change, they embark on yet another program and start to engage in a further change initiative. So you're getting change overlap and change fatigue as a result of that. Everything seems to be in a constant flux. Everything seems to be moving continually in a change process. Nothing ever seems to settle. And that can affect some people in some ways. Personally, that's the biggest challenge I used to find in previous work, particularly in the military. We never seemed to settle on a change before we were introducing a new change. So we were never seeing any benefits. It was constant churn, constant battle to try and reach to the end without ever getting there. An interesting point is the middle management's predisposition for change. We get drivers of change. We get the people who run the organizations, who deliver the strategy, design the strategy, who will dictate change that needs to be done. And often it's the middle management that are the most resistant to change because of how much it affects them and how much effort they need to put in to lead organizations effectively, to manage the change process effectively, and to accept the changes required. Because if your boss isn't really committed to the change, then how well can you be committed to that change as well? You will not be able to do so, okay, or find it very, very difficult to do so. Before we move on to how we lead change and how it impacts us a little bit more, I'd just like to cover a little bit on strategy because it's so important that we focus on strategy as a driver for change, because this is the reason that most organizations enter change. And strategy can be driven from the market needs, from the requirement to reorganize the business. There are lots of reasons why the strategy can be introduced and seen as the driver for change within organizations. It's useful just to reflect on what strategy is. Strategy originates from a very ancient Greek principle and was really used to describe the leaders and generals of the armies within Greece in the thousands of years ago when they were dominant around the world. If we define it, it's the art of science of planning and marshalling resources for their most efficient and effective use. I think that's quite an important definition and quite useful because it really allows us to look at various aspects of that. So efficient and effective, that's really what we're trying to introduce through change. The art and science, so that means it's not absolute. It's not always objective. There are subjective elements in this. There are technical or scientific approaches we need to introduce. But art is very, very important. That word art really means to me that it's really about leadership and it's really about how we approach change as leaders that will marshal whether there's success or not. And the resources required, so marshalling resources, how important it is to have the right resources, the right capabilities, and the right people involved in a change for it to be successful. So it's all very good, however, very, very difficult to achieve, particularly in the modern workplace. There is a more common definition which is on the screen here. You may prefer that. I personally prefer the older version because I really do see how that wraps up everything up within strategy itself. So in the current workplace, we are struggling. If I'm honest, the world is changing rapidly, and we're not just talking about the environmental issues of the world or the wars and the battles that are currently raging around the world. We're in a volatile situation. And this acronym VUCA really tries to summarize the different aspects that affect us all and affect our organizations as well. So volatility is really about how quickly things are changing. Nothing ever settles. We're constantly reacting to things that are changing in the workplace and changing around the world as well. We can only look recently at what's happened in Russia and Ukraine, and sadly more recently in Israel and Palestine. These are volatile situations, and they have an impact on all of us, not just emotionally, but from business perspectives as well. Uncertainty is the next one. Uncertainty really is about how sure are we of the outcomes that we're planning to implement? How sure are we that things are going to work out the way we predict they're going to work out? Things, events, and outcomes are very unpredictable as a result. So again, that's another aspect of the VUCA model. The next one is complexity. Nothing is ever simple anymore. Everything is very, very complicated. And sometimes that is by design, sometimes that's deliberately made complicated, but normally it's just the interconnectivity of the world, interconnectivity of businesses. Everything needs to be complicated for it to be successful. So complexity adds an extra dimension to the challenges of trying to identify how we can have an effective strategy and how we can implement effective change as a result. And ambiguity is the last one. So really, it's about what do we really want? Are we sure what the future holds for us? Are we sure what this project is going to give us? Ambiguity means we're really not sure. There's a lack of clarity, and it's difficult sometimes to understand even the situation we're in, not just the situation we want to move to. So the current state to the future state. So VUCA has been researched a lot in the last few years. And this particular extract, I won't ask you to read it, but it was provided by the Harvard Business School. And it's their take really on the different elements that make up VUCA. And they give some examples within this particular text on how each of these are played out in the modern workplace. I'm going to skip over this little video onto the next slide because it really just explains everything I've gone through. So I just really want to move on to the next element if I can. So why do we need to change? I think we have to change. If we stand still, everybody else will overtake us. And that's really what this particular statement is made by Howard Schultz, who was the originator, founder and chairman and former CEO of Starbucks, a very successful organization, obviously, well embedded in Oman as well. And he said that any business today that needs to embrace the status quo, that embraces the status quo as an operating principle, is going to be on a death march. So what he's saying is that we can't stand still. We can't accept the way we do things today are the things we need to do tomorrow. We need to move forward. We need to think of constantly competing with other organisations, competing with the marketplace, and looking for what the next advantage is within business. And that really pushes us to consider change and to set our strategy in terms of how we want to run the business, but how we want to change as well. So by thinking about change in this perspective, it really puts us in the ownership of change. So rather than just accepting things are going to happen, it's about being proactive and identifying what we can do to positively implement change in a good way. Okay, so that's very, very important to think of it that perspective. So the top challenges facing most organisations these days are essentially these kind of questions. So, what are the main things that keeping the leaders awake at night? Well, really, it's about that competitive advantage. It's really about what the next challenge is for the organisation, and the constant flux of what's happening really keeps people awake in terms of trying to second guess, trying to plan, trying to strategize what they need to do to keep the organisation moving forward. And what are the key organisational challenges facing within the organisation? Are they internal? Are they external? More likely to be both. What impact is this having on the business, on customers, on competitors, and so on? So, if you're in a leadership position in an organisation, you have to think about all of these different aspects that are really going to affect how you think about and strategize your organisation in how you're going to deliver change successfully. So, if we look at the risks around the world, was taken a couple of years ago. I don't have the latest version, unfortunately, but it really hasn't changed very much. It's really around what are the things that are going to affect us in the world today. And you can see that some of these are economic, some of them are environmental, some of them are geopolitical, societal, and technological as well. So there's a whole range of different things covered in this aspect, but they're all equally important. And you can see that they are, things that keep people awake at night. We've recently gone through a pandemic, so infectious diseases is obviously in people's minds, and people are worried about the next pandemic that may happen in the near future. Extreme weather events are happening all over the world currently. We're seeing record environmental events, all negative, unfortunately, that are really sort of telling us how important it is we need to capture that and how we need to make a change to get our environment back under control. From a technical perspective, cybersecurity is a big issue, and about how we protect our data and how we protect ourselves. And more recently, with the introduction of ChatGPT as an AI application, and more AI applications coming out this year, that is a big worry for most people as well. So these are the kind of things we need to think about from a strategic level within an organisation that really can affect our change and allow us to be sidetracked from achieving what we want to achieve. So there are different types of change we may want to consider. And this is just 3 examples here. So we have what we call developmental changes. So these are really those changes that are going to improve your current business procedures. So these tend to be something that's going to have a positive effect on future business. Okay. Transitional changes are really things that are taking us from one state to another. So this is really the change process we talked about earlier on, moving from one state to another state. So what's going to replace our existing processes with new processes? And that's the transitional change we need to go through. Both transitional change and developmental change tend to be fairly incremental, tend to be move along at a certain pace and move along bit by bit. Whereas transformational change is something that's a big player, a big change, something that completely reshapes the balance of things and moves you into a completely different sphere. So transformational change is a big thing. And obviously, because it's a big thing, it's very complicated, very difficult to achieve, and requires more resources, more effort, more leadership, and everything else we've talked about so far. So these are different types of change, and it's important to identify what type of change you're going through or what type of change you're planning so that your strategy can be appropriate in terms of achieving success. So if we look at going back to what Schultz was saying earlier on, we can't just change with change. We have to lead change, because if we don't lead change, we're going to get caught up in the minutiae of detail. We're not really going to have a clear strategy of where we want to go and where we want to lead the organisation, and really we're not going to be able to be proactive in our thinking and proactive in our approach to safety to change as well, because going through change has a personal psychological impact on us as a human being. It affects the way we think, it affects our levels of stress and our levels to cope with the situation we find ourselves in. And this is why people become resistant to change, because it's an uncomfortable place to be and people don't want to be there. And often the best way to avoid that is to be resistant of change and prevent yourself from having to be part of that change journey. And that's probably one of the most difficult things to overcome in an organization when you want to implement a change effectively. So if people are fearful for change, if they're hopeful for change, if they're confident for change, if they're complacent, these are different aspects of our mindset that affect our attitude towards change as a result. And we'll come back to more to this a little bit later. So we talk about change, but we also talk about project management, and those two kind of elements really are interlinked. And this is what this particular slide is showing now, is that the elements or the stages of a project management process, from project initiation to closing out the project, are also overlapped in how we organize change management within in a change environment. That could be a work environment, social environment, or whatever it is. We need to prepare for change. We need to manage the change and plan for it. We need to execute the change. We need to do something different and implement a new change. And then we need to close that out. Often we need to monitor the change to make sure it's embedded, to make sure we don't go backwards, and actually the change becomes the new way we do things. So you can see how interlinked these two different processes are, and often we'll use a project management approach to see a successful change management project delivered. So let's look at different aspects of how we start the change process then. The first thing, as we said before, is to identify what we need to change. What are the business drivers? What are the reasons that we need to have a strategy for change or a change plan in place? We can use different approaches to identify what those things are. So the pestle analysis, I'm sure you're very familiar with this, really allows us to look at the different aspects of this. And I showed you a graph earlier on of the different risks and the different concerns around the world these days, and they were using pestle to demonstrate that. So we had technological, we had sociological, we had economic and geopolitical risks highlighted within that list. So pestle is a good model. It's really a macro model, so it allows us to look outside of the organization and look at the different elements that affect our organization and what could derail our change. But more importantly, what are the opportunities for change that we've identified by analyzing all of this? Okay, so it's a very positive outlook rather than a negative outlook we're looking for, but it will also help to identify the challenges we may face as we start to implement the change we're planning to do. It's very useful to look at the forces for change. So this is a different perspective on the pestle model, and it has some different elements as well. And you can basically use this kind of model to identify the specifics within your own organization, which will help you to think about change and how you can implement change for good. Okay, so it has various aspects of the pestle model in here, but also other aspects that you may want to consider as part of how you decide what change to think about, what change to plan for, what change to implement, and what change to set as your strategy within the organization. So the change process then. So as I said, we need to identify what the change needs to be. There may be various options we need to consider. And once we've identified those options, then we would then decide which is the most effective, the most efficient, and the most likely to succeed. And we would likely to select that particular option to go forward. Sometimes the option is to do nothing. When we're setting up a business case, we always have a standard option of do nothing. So if we were to implement any change, we were just to stick with what we currently do, what would that be? And then we can use that as the benchmark to decide how effective other options may be against the current state. Now, obviously, if we're not going to make a change, if we're going to continue to do the as-is approach, then no change will be started. However, we do recognise that sometimes we need to do that, but sometimes it allows us to rethink the change process and rethink the strategy, rethink the options ahead of us, because we don't want to settle on the as-is model. Okay, we don't want to settle on the as-is position, but because we're not able to find anything better, it forces us to go back to the drawing board and think about other options that we could potentially introduce that would make the change we're looking for. So it's a really useful approach to have that sort of foundation, that benchmark for us to score each of the other options against, to make sure that we're doing something that's going to be better for us and more successful in terms of the change we're looking for in the organization. So once we've selected the option, we then need to initiate that project. We need to manage the project from start to finish. We need to measure how effective the change has been implemented and make sure it's sustained and embedded. And that takes a lot longer than most people realize. And then as we've gone through that whole journey, what is the opportunity for us to learn lessons in that process, so that when we go into the next change process, we could be better informed and better skilled and more competent to implement that change more effectively. So it's a cyclical process because, as I said, change is constant, and we'll be finishing one project and then going back and starting another project, and continually learning from the process to make sure that what we do next time is better than what we did last time. My slides are frozen, so bear with me a second. Okay. So one of the key models, I'm sure you've heard of this particular model, but I think it's useful to go through. I do have a little video clip later on that looks at the model in detail. If any of you are familiar with Our Iceberg is Melting, it's really a parable, a story that explains each of these steps of the Kotter model. So the Kotter 8-step model was designed by John Kotter from Harvard Business School at the time, who basically, through a huge amount of research that he did and an award-winning book that he wrote called Leading Change, he really introduced this concept of the 8-step model. I'll go through this in a bit more detail a bit later. It's a fundamental model in terms of change management, highly recommended. And if you want to implement a change project and you follow the steps of this model, you won't go far wrong. Okay, so we'll cover that in a bit more detail a bit later. Lewin's three-stage model, again, is worth considering. This looks at change in a simplistic approach. And when I mentioned previously around this current state to future state, that's really what Lewin's model is reflecting. So to make a change, we need to unfreeze the current situation and be ready for change. Then we need to change, so we implement a change, and then we need to refreeze that and stick it. So we need to embed that and make sure that what we've changed to is the right approach and is what we now do as our normal business. So it's just reflecting the current state to future state process and what we need to do to achieve the successful change, thinking about it from that perspective. It's a very useful model. Something I would highly recommend to look at it from a strategic perspective and helping you to shape the kind of change you want and what the end result of change should look like. So Lewin's three-stage model is also a very good and effective model to look at and consider change. The ADCA model really focuses on the people aspect of change and about the emotions people go through and what strategies we need to put in place to be able to manage and support people through that process. We can't force people to follow the change. We are better suited to really understand how to get a successful change. We need to understand the journey people are going through, and the ADCA model really identifies the stages we go through and allows us to consider and recognize where people are on that journey. So the first stage is around awareness. How aware are people of the change they're going to go through? How accepting of that are they? Is there a desire for change? That's the next one. If not, do we need to create that desire? How do we turn people on to this change? How do we get people committed to the change, engaged in the change? That desire really is something that we want to create. We need to give people knowledge. We need to give people an understanding of what the change is all about and what their part in that change journey is going to be as well. And that is something we should never underestimate. We can never over communicate. We can never over explain. We can never give too much information around change. But what we do need to give is information and knowledge that is understandable. It's much better to break it down into bite-sized information as well, and to make it simple for people to understand. Simplicity is the key thing here. So lots of little bits of information are much more effective than giving people a huge strategy and expecting them to absorb that information. Ability is the next one. Do we have the ability and capability to change? Are people able to follow that journey? Are people able to come along with you on that journey and successfully get to the end? And then once we get to the end of the process, how do we reinforce that change to stop people going back to the old habits, stop people going back to the old ways they used to work before? We want to prevent that. So reinforcement is quite an important step. Reinforcement sounds quite a sort of a deliberate term in terms of we're forcing people or reinforcing people to behave in a certain way. It's much more empathetic than that. It's about recognizing what we need to do to encourage people to reinforce the new habits that they've created and the new change that they've moved to. So it needs to be thought from a people perspective rather than a process perspective. The outcome model is quite useful, particularly, as I said, from considering it from a people perspective. Far too often in change, we think about a process and the people who have to follow the process rather than putting people at the heart of the process. Because without the people changing, the process will never change. And that's a key aspect we need to consider. Another model is the bridge transition model. Again, this is very much focused on the empathetic or people-centered process of change and try to get people to accept uncertainty or to create a level of uncertainty within people, but in a positive way. Remove the skepticism, the doubts, the anger, the resistance, allow people the ability to explore the new ways of working and look at the positives of those, and then seek their commitment at the end. This process goes through an end, a transition, and a new beginning, which essentially is current state to future state, as we've talked about before. Another way of thinking about change is to look at how effective we need to be in communicating change. And this Spexman's model really creates a framework to allow us to put together a communication plan, essentially, that makes us think about all these different aspects of change from a communication perspective and what we need to do to communicate the change itself, how we need to communicate as we transition through the change and implement the changes we're putting in place, how do we embed that change at the end, and how do we measure success as well. So there are different aspects of this, the communication, the leadership part of it, the process itself, the knowledge and skills people need, what measures are we going to use, and how do we reward people and reward the process for achieving that. At the heart of this model, you can see managers. I personally would put down as leaders because to me, leadership is required more so than management. But nevertheless, the model is an effective way and is really a checklist for you to plan an effective communication process. The next model is Roger's technology adoption curve. And this is really a reflection of how we change as people. So when we get a new technology or a new approach coming into the marketplace, we always get the early innovators, the people who want to lead that, the people who want to be the first to get the new tech, the people that want to be the first to have a new process, the people that really want to drive and be the first on anything. These are what we call the innovators. Then we get the early adopters. So these are the people who see the benefit of this, are curious about how things work and want to be part of that. So they've seen the innovators driving a particular change or driving a new technology, accepting something, and they want to be part of that as well. Then we get the early majority. So this is where we start to get the bow wave of people start to sign up to this, starting to want to be part of this as well. And then they tend to be the majority. And then the late majority are those people just behind who follow on because their peers have followed on because their partners have followed on, people, their team have gone on and accepted this, so they want to accept that as well. So they're kind of being peer pushed into this in some respects, but again, they are following on from the early adapters as well. Finally, you have the laggards. These are the people who completely resist the change, don't want anything to do with it, resist the benefits, resist the technology, simply don't want to hear. Okay, I've got a really good example of this from an organization perspective. I used to work with somebody who used to refuse to accept technology. When emails systems first started to come out 15, 20 years ago, however long ago it was, we started to use emails within our organization. This person refused to do that. He would rather write a post-it note, put it on your desk, rather than send you an email. You know, he was constantly putting these post-it notes around everywhere. His name was Frank, so he would have an F mail rather than an email. So it was a Frank mail he was sending around in his post-it notes because he simply refused to get on board and adopt the technology of computing and emails. Very strange thing is he's now campaigning for technology, realised the benefits of technology, and has actually become more of an early adopter than a laggard in terms of the progression of the use of IT within the workplace. So people do change. You know, we can be an innovator or an early adopter in one particular project if something aligns with our way we think or the way that we like to work. And in other ways, we can be laggards and we can move up and down this curve in terms of where we are, depending on that particular change process. As you see, this is a normal distribution pretty much because everything in the world is a normal distribution. So it makes sense that we look at it from that perspective too. Probably the most famous model, other than Kotter's 8 steps, is the McKinsey 7S model. And really, this focuses on 7 different aspects. It's a useful way to look at the different relationships between different aspects of change and how they all need to be considered for a change to be effective. You'll see that 3 of them are blue, so these are what we call the hard S's. These are processes or something tangible. So that'll be a strategy, the structure, that'll be the organizational structure of the project, or the organizational structure of the project is being worked on, or the change is happening. And we have the systems. So these are processes and procedures that allow us to do something. These are all what we call hard S's. The other 4 are green because they're more soft S's. So these are more related to people and to attitudes and to culture. So we've got shared values. So we need a shared belief in what we're doing with this project or with this change and how we're driving that. It's very, very important. Everybody's looking at the same thing. Everybody's looking at it in the same way, and everybody's working together to achieve what you want to achieve. Skills is really about knowledge and competence. Staff is about the people and the emotional aspect of people and how they feel about change. And then style is really the approach that we need to use to glue all these things together as well. So the founders of this model basically identified that we need to focus on all of these 7 things concurrently. We can't just focus on one and ignore another one. We have to focus on all 7. And if we don't have all 7 working together, then the change is unlikely to be successful. So if we put too much emphasis on hard S's, for example, or even too much emphasis on soft S's and not enough on the hard S's, we're unlikely to get an effective project. So the McKinsey 7S can be used for different things as well, but certainly is an effective approach for change as well, particularly within an organizational context. So why do people react to change? And more importantly, why do people resist to change? So people can react to change in a positive way. People can see that as a benefit. And they, as I said, they could be the innovators or the early adopters, and they will drive and want to be part of that change. Most people, as we see, will want to resist change, particularly in the initial stages. So why is that the case? And that's really what we want to talk about for the next few minutes. So people have perceptions about change, and that comes from their own experiences and their own culture and their own beliefs and values. So it's not the event itself that causes the stress. It's how people feel and how people react to the change is really what causes the stress. So it's not the actual change itself; it's the people's reaction to change that causes that stress. Okay, and that's really what this statement is telling us here. So when we're implementing change, coming up with a change strategy or coming up with a plan, an implementation plan, the hard side of change is relatively easy thing to do, even in a complex change program. The more harder thing to do is to understand how people are going to react to that and the level of stress we're going to be putting on people and how we manage those stresses through that particular process and how we get people to be in a comfortable state at the end of the process, having survived that journey is really key to what we're trying to do. So what is the key to implementing change? The title communication kind of gives it away to a certain extent, and it's really about engagement. So it's really about how we communicate, how we engage people to be part of that change process. So there are, from a communication perspective, and how we communicate change, there is a 5W model, which you might find useful, and that is who should be told, um, when should they be told, what should they be told, where should the message be conveyed, and who should control the communication process. So those are the 5 Ws, and as part of your communication strategy, you will be able to identify at various stages of the project each element of these questions. So who should be told, when should they be told, what should they be told, and where should the message be conveyed? That's either face-to-face, email, whatever communication process and communication channel you want to use. That needs to be important. And then who should control that communication process? It's very, very important that you have control of communication so that people don't start to gossip and listen to rumor. There needs to be an official channel of communication, something that's reliable, robust, and is accepted by people going through the change. Otherwise, the communication tends to fail. One of the key things going back to how the message is conveyed, we learn and we receive information in different ways. Some people are very receptive to things like social media. Some people are very receptive to face-to-face communication. Some people like to receive written information rather than verbal information. We're all different in the way that we like to receive and communicate ourselves. So when we're communicating messages, we need to do it multi-channel. So we shouldn't just say we'll send an email out or we'll do a town hall meeting. You need to reinforce the messages through lots of different channels if that message is important. And in a change process, the message will be important. Getting the message right is key, but conveying it in the right way and through multi-channels is a very useful thing to do, and it's likely to contribute to the success of your communication. Okay, so the next one I want to just briefly cover are the barriers to change. Our brains are wonderful things. They are enable us to learn, they enable us to work, enable us to understand a huge amount of complexity, um, and uh, and to basically live in the modern world. And we're constantly evolving, and we're constantly moving on to new ways of working, new technologies, and so on. But even though our brains like consistency, they are very lazy, and they don't like something that's VUCA. We talked about volatility, we talked about certainty, and so on earlier on. Our brains don't like that. They like consistency. They like routines. Okay, and the reason they like that is because they like to automate as much as possible. And a good way of thinking about this is if we drive to work every day and we drive along the same route, we kind of don't even remember the journey most mornings unless something eventful happens. Now, if something eventful was to happen, our brains would suddenly wake up, switch on, and we'd be able to react to that in a certain way. But if we don't need to do that, if the journey's routine and there's nothing really to worry about, Nothing's out of the ordinary. Everything's the same routine as it was yesterday. The brain will switch off and start to focus on other things. And that's really the consistency that it likes. So routine is key for the brain, and that's what it likes. So it sees change as a threat. It doesn't like change because then it disrupts the consistency, disrupts the habits and the routines that we create. So therefore, this is why we need to focus. The most critical thing, and I've kind of explained this already, is that the people side of change is probably the most important part of change. So that's really why we need to focus on that, because our brains will put up all the defenses it possibly can to prevent its consistency, its routines, its habits being disrupted. And this is really what this kind of model here is actually showing. So the success of change can be very small, and the reasons for change failing can be very big, and the numbers are very high. And that could be employee resistance to change. It could be management behaviours. We talked about important middle management as well earlier on. Inadequate resources and budget, and then other obstacles. Just the budgets and resources is an important part. I find from my own experiences that very often a project is announced as a change initiative. It's all marketed and communicated very well. The benefits are seen, and then as we start to implement that change, the board of directors will suddenly cut a little bit off the budget or want to tinker with the plan, and eventually the change becomes something different. Not because, but necessarily by design, but by the fact that they haven't allowed the change to work through the way it was originally planned, the way it was originally resourced, the way it was originally budgeted. So these things are very important to see things through. Coming from the UK, we get lots of government projects which get introduced over the years. People tend to want to rip off governments and try to charge a lot more, and most government projects tend to fail. A really good example of that is in the UK is ID cards. You have a very successful process in Oman, good controls, a great system that works. ID cards is a mandatory process, whether you're a resident or a national. You have an ID card system, and it works very well. They tried to implement it in the UK, spent billions of pounds trying to implement something. It all completely failed. And when you try to understand the reasons for that, most of the reasons were changes in requirement, changes in resources, changes in budget. As a new government came into power, it would change the budget, it would slash it, or it would make a change in different areas of the project, which really meant the project should be replanned and re-energized and go back and basically restart itself. And there was constantly this cycle of not moving forward with the change, and eventually it's costing the government so much that particularly coming up close to an election, they want to be seen to be doing the right thing, and then they kill projects. And that happens so often in organisations or particularly in governments around the world. So the inadequate resources of budget isn't necessarily inadequate to start with, but it becomes so at the end. I heard a story a few years ago. I'm not sure how true this is, but I think it really emphasises the benefit or the point I'm trying to make here. When the new airport in Muscat was being built, it was struggling, and probably struggling for the same reasons. There was huge amounts of delay, mainly caused from environmental issues in terms of flooding in the area where they were going to build the new runway. And obviously that had to be reinforced. It took a few years to do that. But the project seemed to be struggling in many different areas. And I believe that somebody took control of the project at the ministerial level and basically stopped any further changes to the plan. So whatever was designed would be built. That was it. And that really pushed the project forward. It was then built successfully, and then changes were then made after the project had been finished. So there was a minor little changes that need to be doing. They were done after the event. Because if that person hadn't taken control, then we probably still wouldn't have a new airport in Muscat today. So that's just an example. Like I say, I don't know how true that story is, but it's a great story. If it isn't true, it should be. And that really just explains how important it is to maintain the vision, to maintain the focus on the project, and deliver what you set out to deliver, and then you can make the modifications and changes later on. So if we look at the perceptions of change, and this is again going back to the way we think about change, there are positive perceptions and negative perceptions. We are predisposed in terms of human beings to look at negative things. So if we look at a diagram like this, the first thing we're drawn to is the negative perceptions rather than the positive perceptions. Now that is a generalization. Some people will obviously be drawn to the positive rather than negative, but most people will be drawn to the negative first. And we'll look at what all the negative aspects are about change before they look at the positives. But it's useful just to reflect on what this list is telling us. So if we look at the positives first, I'm going to go against the grain here. Positive perception is that it's small, incremental, predictive, positive, productive, and so on. Whereas the negative perception is going back to what we talked about with Booker. So it's huge, it's too big, it's going to be a complete disaster, it's unpredictable, we're not going to get any benefits, it's just a negative process we need to work through. It just affects our current job, so it becomes unproductive. All of these things tend to be negative things that we think about first before we think about the positive things. And when we're trying to convince people to get onto the change train and join us on the journey, we need to focus on the positive aspects and focus on the positive perceptions to try and get people to buy into the process and to get engaged within the project itself. And that's very, very important. So we can see signs as leaders in organizations or even within teams with our peers and our colleagues. If we just stand back and look at it, we can see lots of resistance to change and the signs for those resistance to change. People will become more non-compliant and will want to complain about lots of things, and we have lots of negative reactions to every part of the change that people are going through. They'll look at reasons why they don't want to do it rather than reasons why they should. Absenteeism, it can affect people in a way that they prefer not to come to work and will make any excuse not to be in work. So the level of absenteeism can rise significantly during a change project, particularly a complex, wide-ranging change project. We also get the concept of presenteeism, so not just absenteeism where people are not in work. Presenteeism means that they're in work, but they're not really productive. They're not really focused on their job. They're just basically clock watching. So they're there because they have to be. They're there because they want to earn money, but they're not really contributing either to the organization's work, but more importantly to the change that the organization is going through. We see loss of wastage in many different ways. So we see loss of wastage in the fact that resources aren't deployed effectively, and sometimes we overspend on certain things without any consequences. Also, people see the opportunity to use the change to get other things into their budget or other things they're looking for that they're not able to get in their normal budget, and then they push that into the project as well as an opportunity to get what they want. And people aren't necessarily concerned about budget because it's somebody else's budget and they will just spend what they want to spend within the level of controls that they have and not really have any consequences to that like they would with their normal department budget. Low standards of efficiency is a challenge. This means that people don't want to put any effort into what they're doing in the change project. They would rather carry on with their day job and more or less be forced into doing things. And when they are doing it, they're not fully engaged with it, not fully committed to it, and therefore the efficiency of their output is lower than they would be otherwise. You may get deliberate action or deliberate restriction to the productivity of the project and the change itself. And that may impact the speed of change. It may impact the plan in terms of each of the milestones being achieved, and so on. Ultimately, you may get some aggression as well. You will get a certain stage of the cycle of change where people do become aggressive. Normally, that's aggressive in terms of their own feelings towards the change project, but sometimes this can manifest itself in a reaction to management. So management can see this within people and have to deal with the conflict as a result of the aggression people are showing. It's extreme, but it does happen on most projects. And I've seen it on a number of occasions in projects I've been involved with. Just bear with me, it's freezing again. So just want to move on to the next slide. Okay. If we look at people being resistant to change, we'll continue the discussion on this a little bit. People don't resist the change, they resist being changed. And that's, I think, a key aspect we need to consider. So I've talked about habits and routines previously. This is the way we've always done it. Why do we need to change? They're comfortable in what they're doing. They don't see the need for that change to happen because they know what they're doing. They're happy with that habit or routine that they have. Why would they want to change it? They prefer to keep with the status quo. Uncertainty, people are unsure what the future holds. So levels of anxiety come into it because anxiety is really stress, thinking about the future and what will happen. So that uncertainty plays on people's minds, but they're not sure whether they're going to see any benefit of that change, and therefore it affects them and they become resistant. People may be self-interested. What I mean by that is that their own agenda or what they want out of what they're doing may be different from what the change is trying to implement. So it may be distracting them, or it may be preventing them from what they want to do, and therefore they may not have aligned goals, and therefore may not want to follow with the changes required. Misunderstanding and poor communication is probably one of the biggest ones, next to habit and routines. And as I said, communication is so critical in the project, and it's so important we get that right. We should never underestimate how much we should communicate, and how often we do it, and the channels we should use to do that. Lack of trust. Trust is a big thing in an organization. If people feel safe in an organization, and we talk about psychological safety a lot, psychological safety means that people feel safe within an organization, that they're going to be protected by the organization, they're going to be looked after, and the organization has their interests at heart. That may not actually be the case, but as long as people feel that, you will get trust and cooperation as an output of that. Psychological safety is very difficult to achieve and very difficult to maintain. And the level of psychological safety you have dictates how much trust people have in you as an organization and how much trust they have in what you're trying to do. So lack of trust can really derail the way the team is focused on change, and will put up a huge amount of resistance accordingly. Peer pressure. So all my friends and my colleagues don't want to change, therefore I have to fall in line. I don't want to be the person that accepts it when everybody else doesn't want to. Peer pressure is a big thing, and again, we shouldn't underestimate the impact of peer pressure on the way people respond to change within the work environment. Time, there might be too little time. There might be too much pressure on people to change too quickly, and people feel they don't have the time to do that, and therefore they will hold back and resist doing that. And then finally, feeling victimized. So again, going back to peer pressure to a certain extent, if I don't follow the change, I may be victimized. But more importantly, here is if I follow the change, go against what my team is doing, or go against what my peers are doing, I'm going to get victimized as a result of that. And again, that goes back to psychological safety and how trusted people feel, or how safe people feel within the organization. Okay, so these are some of the things that happen, or some of the indications we see as to why change doesn't happen and why people resist being changed. That's the key aspect of that. So we talked about psychological movement of change in the way people are affected by that. The Kubler-Ross change curve is a very famous curve. I'm sure you've seen it before, but I think it's important just to include it in the presentation because it really just brings everything together from a people perspective. Now, this was originally researched and introduced as part of people's reaction to a loss, and this was a loss of bereavement loss, and the journey people go through in terms of bereavement before they basically get back to a steady state again. And it's important that everybody goes through this. We all go through this in any sort of change situation. The speed that we go through it and the amount each of these elements affect us will differ in each individual, but also differ in each situation. So as long as we're aware of the journey that people go through, we can then identify, what stage people are at and try to help them through that stage onto the next stage. So stability is where we are today. Immobilization is the change that's happening to us. We first off deny that change, and that's where denial comes in. Then we become very, very angry about it. Then we start to bargain to try and bring the change in line with what we want rather than what the change is forcing us to do. And then we become depressed because we can't do that. The bargaining hasn't worked. We have to fall in line. We can't get what we want, and then we become depressed about it. Then we get around that corner, we start to see the benefit of change, and we see that actually, over time, this we're able to see the benefits of this, and this is where the testing element comes into it. We're testing different aspects of this change and seeing the benefits, and then finally we accept that. So this is a standard thing that we all go through, and as I said, some of us will get through this process very, very quickly, and would not even recognise the different stages we go through. Other people will get stuck on a particular stage or take a long time to go through each of the stages before they accept the change. For a particular change project, some people may never ever get to acceptance. They'll either leave the organisation before they get there. Maybe there's a further change that's introduced and they have to start the whole journey again. There may be reasons why they don't get to the end, but we want everybody to get to the end because that's really what's going to allow us to embed the change and make the change effective as a result. Okay, so this is some of the priorities that we may want to consider when we want to minimize the resistance to change. Now, I'm focusing a lot on resistant change in people because, as I said before, this is the most important aspect of any change in any organization. So communication, we've said that already. Clear communication for the reason for change is very, very important. A bit of humility, a bit of empathy is required. And even as a leader, we know the change is going to be difficult. Let's be open and honest about that. Let's admit that this is not something that's going to be easy for us. And we're all in this together. That's a really good way of explaining it. And trying to identify, ways where you can bring people on board. You can have a connection with people. I know you're not going to be happy with this. I know you're going to struggle through this process. So am I. Let's work together and get through this together. And that's the openness and honesty and the humility that we're looking for. And this is something leaders are encouraged to have these days. The leaders of old, when I was an apprentice and working early on in my career, was that the leader was somebody that was perfect in everything. And whatever the leader said, we did, and the leader wasn't allowed to make a mistake. The leader did everything right. All of these things, we put the leader up on a pinnacle, and we said this, this is what we all want to aspire to be, somebody that is perfect. We know nobody is perfect. We all know we make mistakes, and it's about being open and honest about that and recognizing it's okay to not be okay. It's okay to make a mistake and learn from it, because we actually learn from our mistakes more than we learn from the things that go right. So being an open and honest is a bold thing. It's a courageous thing required, but as a leader, we should really be focused on that as much as we can. Involving the right people in the planning of the process, involving the right people at various stages of the process is very, very important. So the stakeholders, we really need to understand who are the stakeholders involved in the change. We mentioned this at the very start. So we're looking internal stakeholders and external stakeholders. And depending on what role they play within the change, will dictate what kind of strategy we need to have to deal with those people. Some people we just need to communicate to and keep informed. Some people we need a decision from, so we need to keep them happy and to feed them the right information at the right time. Some people we know are going to resist change, so we want to put a strategy in for that as well. So it's really about knowing the people involved and how it's going to affect them, and more importantly, what you need from them for the project to be successful, or for the change to be implemented. Incorporate ideas, suggestions from key stakeholders where possible. So really it's about involving everybody in the process. So where people have ideas or suggestions, if they're credible and we accept them, we're going to get their buy-in because it's their idea, it's their suggestion that we've adopted. And often once we implement a change or we plan a change, It's not always the most efficient way of doing things, and we should recognise that people involved in that change, or even people outside of that change, may have a better way of doing it, may come up with different ideas or different suggestions, and it's useful to incorporate those where we feel they're possible. Now, you can't just accept any ideas or any suggestions because they come from people and you want people to buy into the process, but where you can, you should accept those ideas. Where you don't, you should explain why. And that, again, can be a hook into people and get them either to come up with more ideas and be part of that project. And that engagement will come from that for sure. And this is where the buy-in is so important, because if we get the buy-in from the people, particularly the key people from our stakeholder engagement, the people who have the influence and the power, we're likely to get much more traction for the change, and it more likely to happen as a result. We need to fully address any concerns people have. So if people express concerns, particularly when we get to a stage of people either bargaining or people voicing their concerns about change or voicing their resistance, we need to have a reaction to that in a positive way. So, I hear what you say. However, this is why we need to do this. These are the kind of things you would hear leaders talk about during these kind of situations. So change creates opportunities for success, and we talk about this management phrase of low-hanging fruit, and about when we're implementing a change, we do it from a lean process as well. If we want to make a change, we look at what benefits we could quickly get from the process. Is there something we could do quickly that's going to give us a benefit that can encourage people to be part of the next stage of that journey of change? So these, successes should be explored. They should be taken, and they should be communicated out to demonstrate the success of the way the project is going to work through. Whether it is or not, it doesn't matter. But the early stages are very, very important to try and encourage people to get along. So get people recognition for their contribution. That this is good leadership anyway. If people contribute to the project in any way, we should recognise that and feed back to them that's been recognised. Focus on the positive elements of change. Try to avoid the negativity. Always look at the positive side of a situation. There are always positives. We could look at the recent pandemic as an example of we could have got bogged down in negativity, but even though sadly a lot of people were affected by COVID, many people dying and many people having long COVID and other things like that. There are some positives. We now are better able to cope with pandemics, at least in the short term. The acceleration of the vaccine program was a result of the positive aspects of looking at the change that we've been forced to go through from that particular situation. And try to keep the momentum going with change. Try to not let it lapse. The pace of change needs to be consistent. There will be periods where it starts to slow down, and there are periods where it starts to speed up, but we need to keep the momentum going. We can't just stop and then try to restart the change. It'd be very, very difficult to do that, because the minute we stop a change, people will start going back to the way they used to work before, because it's all about habits. Okay, people are habitual. People develop habits, and that's the way that they work. So unless we change habits, and we can't really change habits, to be perfectly honest here, all we can do is replace existing habits with new habits. So old habits are replaced by new habits. That is what we talk about when we change habits. We can't physically change what people do. All we can do is give them something else to do instead of what they were doing before. We've covered this already, so I'm going to skip over that particular model. I'm just going to skip forward a few slides if I can, because I really want to talk about this model. So we talked earlier on about the change model by Kotter, the 8-step model. And really, I want to focus a little bit of time on this, because I think if you want to implement any change, this is a really good model to follow and a really good way of successfully seeing change in any organization or any context. So as it says, there's 8 steps. We'll go through each of those steps quite quickly, and then I've got a little video to show you on this called Our Iceberg is Melting. It's only around 10 minutes, but it really encapsulates all elements of this, and I think it'll be useful for you to see that. So the first thing we need to do is create a sense of urgency. What that means, we need to create an unsettling or a desire for change. So we need to create a situation where people want to change. So they recognize there is something that needs to happen. So you encourage them to be involved in that change from the outset. So that sense of urgency, that desire for change is very, very important. Without it, the change will never get off the ground. So really, it's very important that we consider the sense of urgency as the first step on the Kotter model. It's really about grabbing people's attention, getting them involved early on, getting them encouraged, getting them motivated, getting them engaged with change as much as possibly can. And that sense of urgency is the key step. Pull people together into a guiding team. So what we're talking about here is get the right people involved to get the project going, to get the planning in place, to get the communication in place, to get the right leadership driving the project. All of these things are very, very important. You need a commitment. You need a team that's gelled together, or different stakeholders that gel together, all going in the right direction, all going in the same direction. That's what we're looking for. And whatever resources are needed, they should be found and brought in to be able to achieve this. In theory, it sounds great. In practice, it's much more of a challenge, obviously, because we all have different things to do, and sometimes change is another aspect we have to focus on. But this is really what we want to try to do. If we're going to be successful in the change, we need to get the right people in the room. We need to get the right people together and all focused in the same direction, all following that vision, that output of what you want the change program to be. So from that, we need to create the vision and strategy. Now, one of the good leadership traits we always talk about is role modeling. Besides role modeling, it's about setting a vision. Where do we want the organization to go? In this case, where do we want the change to go? What is the end state we're looking for? What is the new state? We talked about future states earlier on. What is the future state? What does it mean? And then what is the strategy that's going to drive us to that future state? That's really where we want to focus. Because that vision is where everybody's going to be aiming for. And that alignment with those visions and expectations is very, very important. So aligned with that, it's not about, can I come up with a vision for a change? Yes, I probably can. Can I communicate it to people in a way that they all are all convinced that that's where we want to go? And that is the biggest challenge of any leadership role within change. How can I convince people to be on the same page as me? How can I convince people to be on the same journey as me, be on that train? So we're all heading in the same direction. And we shouldn't just assume that once we set that, that it will continue. We need to refresh that on a regular basis to make sure we stay on track. It's very easy when we're doing change to get sidetracked, to go down tangents, to go down rabbit holes, to basically take us off track where we want to be. And this is why the vision needs to be re-emphasized on a regular basis. The same vision. We may talk about it in different perspectives, but ultimately it's the same end result that we're looking for. And it's very, very important that we do that as well. People need to know the direction we're moving in. Otherwise, we create uncertainty. Otherwise, we create mistrust. People will start to look at the negative aspects of change rather than the positive aspects of change. We need to communicate, and we talked about communication already. So the understanding is important. It's not a case of this is what we're doing. Why are we doing it? And what benefits are we going to get? So the why is very, very important here. And that's really what people want to believe in. They want to believe in the why. What's the reason for it? What benefits are we going to get? Why are we doing this? That's the most important part. And then from that, you'll get your buy-in. So when people understand, when people feel trusted, as I said before, feel in a safe organization, they will start to cooperate. And that's really what we're looking for here. So the buy-in is very important. Notice we're 4 steps in, and only now are we talking about buy-in and about bringing people along and looking at the people aspect of this process in any detail. So empower others to act. We want to give clear direction. This is the key part of leadership of this particular process, really. Effective leadership is really what's going to empower other people to be part of this, to want to be part of it, to be engaged, and really supporting the change that we're trying to put in place. And as you can see at the bottom of the slide here, talked about short-term goals earlier on, about low-hanging fruit. It's very, very important that we set those and get people to see benefits very, very early on in the progress. So we need to plan on those. We need to produce these short-term wins. We plan for them. We need to implement them as much as we can because that really encourages people, or as it says here, gives an impetus for change that people want to see. Okay, so people become believers in change when they see benefits being realized. And these short-term wins allow us to do that. And don't let up. I don't I can't underestimate the importance of how long it takes to implement and react to change. And we can't just assume that because we've done everything right up to a point now, it's going to stay where it is and we continue to move forward. Change is only really effective when, as I said, we replace old habits with new habits, old routines with new routines. We have a future state realized, a future state embedded, and that's really when change is important. And on that journey, there'll be lots of barriers, there'll be lots of resistance at various times, and not just from peaceful, from other aspects as well. We can't give up. We need to continue to look forward. We need to continue to do to deliver this. Stay true to our vision, stay true to our direction, and make sure that we continue to focus on that project. Keep taking people with us to do that. Okay. And then we need to create the new culture. And this is what I talked about embedding everything previously. This is where everything becomes the new normal. So the future state has been realized, and it now becomes the current state before we envisage another future state in the future. So let's play the little video then. Hopefully this will work. That's right.
This is a story about a flock of penguins who live on an iceberg in Antarctica, the South Pole. They are like a big family. They have been living as a colony on this iceberg for years, as far back as they can remember. It is their home. They don't know it yet, but change is coming for them. In order to survive, they will need to learn the change leadership process, one step at a time.
Okay, before I go on to the case study, I would just like to talk a little bit about common errors with organizational change. So I think we've covered most of these already through the discussion we've had so far. So I think it's useful just to reflect on these, just to close out the process of change before we move on to the case study. So allow for complacency. We know there's going to be complacency. We know there's going to be periods in the project where complacency can set in. That could be as part of the obstacles we face as we roll out change, but it could also be complacency in people approaching attitude to change, particularly in a long-term change process, which most of them really are. We need to refocus and maintain the emphasis, maintain the urgency as we go through that process. So try to allow for that. By allowing for that, we recognize it when it happens or prior to it happening, and therefore we can put the right strategies in place to prevent it having an impact on the change we're trying to implement. Failing to create a sufficiently powerful guiding coalition and change team. So as I mentioned earlier on, this was the second step of Kotter's 8-step model. It's really important we get the right people involved in this process, the right sort of leaders in the room, the right change team supporting that process as we go through. Not truly integrating the vision is a common error. So if we don't set the right vision and don't believe in ourselves as leaders, there's no way we can convince people that's the right change. People are very good at reading people. So I might say the right things, but people will be able to tell from my body language that actually I don't really believe in it myself. So even though the right words are coming out of my mouth, people just don't simply believe in it. So you really need to convince yourself first before you try to convince other people that that vision is the right vision. Otherwise, it's not going to be implemented effectively. And if that vision isn't aligned with the strategy you've implemented, if the two things aren't integrated together, again, that's going to derail your change initiative. So you will, as I said before, achieve, get objects or obstacles in your way as you go through the change process, and allowing those obstacles to block your change is something that often happens. We need to be quite proactive in what we do in terms of managing change and look for these obstacles before we get to the point where they become a blocker, and have some measures in place or some ideas in place or some strategies in place to accept that these obstacles are going to happen and how we're going to get around those and avoid the change being blocked. If we don't celebrate the short-term wins, people aren't going to get the buy-in to the process because they don't think we're taking the whole thing seriously. We need to make a big fuss. We need to celebrate the initial successes of the project. In fact, we need to celebrate the whole project. But if we're going to get the buy-in from people, particularly early on in the project, those short-term wins are very, very important. We need to celebrate the success of those because that's really what encourages people to be involved. That's what encourages people to trust what we're doing, to buy into what we're doing, and to continue along the journey with us. I talked about how long it takes to implement change. Declaring victory too soon is because we haven't allowed enough time, haven't made sure that what we're trying to change, that future state we're aiming for, is embedded, and we've got the new routines and new habits in place. All too often, projects fail because we think we've got there. Just because I think we've got there doesn't mean everybody else does as well. Even though I'm leading change, I can declare success, declare victory, but actually people are still a few stages behind me, and the change hasn't necessarily been fully embedded. So it's very important we do that objectively and allow enough time for the victory to be embedded and for the change to be embedded. Sorry, so the victory can be declared. So as we develop a change process and as we put change in place, it's going to affect our culture. It's going to affect our values. It's going to affect the way that we work. We need to anchor those changes in our culture. We need to make sure that we are re-establishing our culture and reflecting on those, making sure they become part of our new culture as we move forward. This is a soft side of it, but often neglected and often results in the fact that people don't move forward in terms of change as well. So again, this is something that can happen, that can derail change. It's something we should try to avoid, something we should really focus on in terms of the culture of the organisation as a result of the change we're implementing. My advice for this, and what I find works best in these kind of situations, is to have somebody that's very connected with the culture, understands the culture, is able to observe the way people work within that culture, the way people react to the culture of the organisation, to reflect that back to you as the leader. Very often, as leaders involved in these kind of changes, we lose sight of the change of the culture and the impact we have on the culture, the impact we have on values, and often we need somebody to reflect that back to us so that we can then make sure that those changes are anchored and become the new culture that we want. So we can't do everything ourselves as leaders. We need to make sure that we have other people within the team or within the guiding coalition, as is termed earlier on, to support us in doing those things that they're good at. So change comes last, not first, or certainly the culture in change comes last, not first. Most alterations in the way that we work are transformational. So the norms and shared values that we have, they are often the last thing to change. So the process is very transformational. A huge change can be implemented, but people need time to settle into that. This is why we shouldn't close out projects too soon. We should allow time for the norms. That's the norms is the habits and routines that we have, and the shared values that we believe in and we align to are in place. And that really is the way we measure that we've actually got there. And we then are at a place where we can close out that change and accept that this is the new way that we work. Sometimes new approaches take time, even after the change has been implemented. But success is the key thing here. We need to demonstrate success. And that's where the quick wins and all of the success of the project are very, very important for these things to be adopted and to be accepted. I've talked about communication before. Feedback and reinforcement are crucial to buy-in. So as I said, just because we've said something once in one particular channel i.e. email or town hall meetings, as I said, doesn't mean that people are going to buy into it or people are going to understand what that is. So feedback, once we do something different on the program or do something on different in terms of change, be that positive or sometimes negative, we need to feedback what we're doing about that. Feedback the successes that we're having. Feedback that this is the next stage of the project, and then reinforce that communication continuously. Because the buying isn't guaranteed. Even when people buy in at the early stage of the project, doesn't mean they're going to stay with us throughout the project. We really need to keep that buying fresh and going all the way through to the end of the change. We have to recognise that sometimes we get people who are just simply not going to change. And the culture of the organisation that we're creating as part of the change and where we want it to be will never be realised with the current people we have in place. So sometimes it's important to recognise, and it's not something we like to do, but sometimes it's important to recognise that sometimes key people need to be changed out. They need to be moved into a different area of the business or have a different focus away from that change that we're focused on, to allow the culture to change the way it needs to change for the change to be embedded. So that needs to be recognised as well. Individuals in each positions need to be on board, as we said already. Otherwise, the old culture will just reassert itself because the leaders will maintain the culture as it was before, unless they've got an emphasis or a sense of urgency to change themselves. So we often blame employees or the teams for failure of change, but the research shows that leadership is the biggest contributor to unsuccessful change projects from a people perspective. And the fact that leadership aren't on board, the fact that leadership doesn't really want to be involved, and is just playing the game. This goes back to believable vision I talked about earlier on as well. Okay. Okay. In the essence of time, I'm just going to skip on to talk about this project. Okay, and this is a real life case study, which is still ongoing actually, in terms of change within an organisation that will really hopefully bring together everything I've been talking about so far this afternoon. So this company is a global company. As you can see from the pictures, it's a packaging company. So they make essentially packaging, cardboard packaging. The picture on the top right is reels of paper that they put into a machine, and then they make cardboard, either single layer, double layer, triple layer, quadruple layer, corrugated cardboard, all the kind of stuff thing you think about in packaging. So cardboard boxes essentially, they make those in all different shapes and sizes for lots of different clients. This company is a global company, as I said, turnover around $9 billion a year. So there's a lot of money in paper for sure, and they're very big in recycling. Okay, so they've gone through a series of changes over the last sort of 15, 20 years. Some of them are based on their desire to be more environmentally friendly. Up until 15 years ago, they also had a plastics division as well as a manufacturing for cardboard division. So they used to make plastic bottles, plastic packaging, and so on. They decided to get out of that market and to sell that side of the business to focus more on recyclable resources and recyclable products. And they implemented this recycle process where they would make a cardboard box, it would go into the supply chain, be used, and then come back as a recyclable product on a 14-day cycle. This is how things move. So it's a fast turning cycle. So besides making cardboard, they also were recycling cardboard. So they were using the recycled products to make new cardboard, and this is where the environmental benefit was being realized. This company is, I still think, the only company that can recycle Costa coffee cups. I know we don't have Costa. Well, Costa's coming back to Oman now, I know, but the Costa coffee cups are quite unique because they have a plasticized inside, and obviously to stop the coffee leaking out. And they have corrugated sides for heat distribution, so you don't feel the heat through the cup. Whereas Starbucks put a cardboard sleeve on your cup, the Costa coffee cups are actually have a serrated or corrugated outer, which actually prevents the heat from coming through and burning your hand, so to speak. And they're able to recycle those. I think they're still the only company that can do that, and they implemented that as part of this sort of initiative of trying to be very environmentally friendly and to recycle as much as they possibly could. So that's all great. That's very strategic projects, being well accepted and well received, well implemented, and all the rest of it. Where I get involved in this is from a safety perspective, and I've been helping this organisation now for the last 4 years, helping to improve safety, and we're doing that through a change initiative. Okay, and I'll explain what that change initiative is in a moment. But we're looking really for the duty of care from the leaders of the organisation to be realised in terms of the way people work on the shop floor. So the change really is around change of culture, change of values, change of process procedures to try and implement a safer working environment. And that is a change in itself. That's what we're talking about, change. Sometimes it's not something that's physical. We have a different layout, or introduce a new machine in this organization, or introduce a new way we do packaging, introduce new materials. Actually, it's about the people and about how do we make the people safer. We need to introduce a change in the culture, a change in the working practices to do that. And that's really what this change project is all about. So how we've done that? We've done this through a process we call leadership in action. And what we've implemented is a whole series of tools and techniques. Some have been very successful. Some are not yet successful. Change is difficult. We have to recognize that. So I'm not going to say everything's perfect, because it isn't. And that's the reality of life. And that's the reality of a change process. This leadership in action was introduced 3.5 years ago. It is still working through. There are some of their manufacturing sites which are far better than others, and that's another reason why this process hasn't yet finished. Just to give a little bit more of a backstory, this company was a big organisation in the UK and Europe, and in the last sort of 20 years decided to go on a huge acquisition route. So their strategy was to buy our competitors, to grow their market share through acquisitions. So where you have different sites around the country and around Europe and around North America where they're buying more sites, they're a global company, so they even have factories in China and other places as well. But my focus is in the UK. That's where I've been working with them. They have 27 different manufacturing sites in the UK and around 45 different recycling plants. In the manufacturing plants, you have, as I said, 27 different manufacturing sites. 15 years ago, that was probably 8 different companies. Now all merged or acquired by DS Smith into their fold, into their family. And what that means is that you have 8 different companies that were essentially managing those 27 sites a few years ago. So you have 8 different cultures, 8 different ways of working, 8 different ways of approaching manufacturing, approaching safety, approaching everything they do. Okay, the end product may be similar. They may be competing on the end product, i.e. a cardboard box. And there's more to a cardboard box than you realise, believe it or not. It's a very technical process and a very technical industry. But that's really what was the driver for change. How do we make the acquisition successful and bring everything into one culture? The perceptive part of this was about not saying that everybody needs to be the same as the old DS Smith, the old company. We're not bringing you in, you have to be like us. Is what's the opportunity to create the new culture for all of these organizations to be one culture? So what can we learn from the organizations that we've acquired to bring into the business? And how can they help us be better at the way we were working before and come up with a new culture, a new way of working? And we did it, as I said, from a safety perspective, because that really what drives the right cultures and the right behaviours. And this leadership in action was the right approach for that. Even though this is focused on safety and safe behaviours, leadership in action has nothing to do with safety in terms of the title, and that's a deliberate thing. So one of the key changes we need to make early on in the programme was to change the roles and responsibilities of people within the organisation. So whereas each manufacturing site had a health and safety manager who was accountable for safety, and everybody went to when they had a safety problem, or if there was an issue, the health and safety manager would basically take ownership of that and take accountability of that. That was changed significantly. So the responsibility for safety was the site general manager's responsibility, nothing to do with the health and safety manager. The ownership, the accountability, the responsibility of safety was put squarely on the general manager of the site. So it's a leadership issue. And the health and safety managers became advisors rather than having a reporting line to the site general managers. They were no longer a direct resource to the general manager. They were a centralized resource headed up by a head of health and safety, who was not in any of the manufacturing. He was more in the corporate role. But those health and safety advisors reported to him. And there was dotted lines to each of the sites that these people were based at. That was a fundamental change. And to be fair, most of the leaders accepted that change. And in fact, that part of it was a fairly easy push and a fairly easy change to implement because the KPIs that they were accountable for were driven that way. So they were kind of forced into that, but most of them accepted it anyway. And most of them had that view anyway. It was just a legacy way that other organizations were working and the way that they merged them into this company. The hardest change was, from that perspective, was the health and safety managers themselves. They suddenly felt under threat. They suddenly felt that, I'm not so important anymore. I'm not responsible for safety anymore. I'm not the go-to person. If something goes wrong, they don't look at me. They look at the general manager or the leader of the site. And the change for those people was much harder to change in terms of culture. And in fact, some of them left the business because of that. They couldn't adapt to change. They couldn't accept the new ways of working. So this is what we did. This is what we're still doing. 3.5 years in, and I'm not going to go through all of the tools. I don't think it's important to do that. I was going to show you a little video, but obviously the volume's not working. Maybe I could just show you a little clip of it because it does have subtitles, so you can maybe read a little bit of that. It's a shame because it's only 3 or 4 minutes long, but it really shows you, the journey they've gone through from a safety perspective, and it shows you the change of ownership and accountability of safety. And the attitude to safety has been much more proactive, and the whole organization culture has changed as a result of that. It's still, as I said, it's still embedding. It's still not fully there yet. It's probably going to take another 3 or 4 years before it does. But the positive benefits are being realized, and they're celebrating the success as they go through. And that is proving to be a very effective approach. So that's the key aspect of that. So they're basically, we're seeing those benefits realized from a safety perspective. But equally importantly, what we're also seeing is the business is benefiting as well, and profitability is up, turnover is up. Not You could argue it's not just because of safety, but safety has a very big bearing on that. And this project has not just led to a safer working environment, it's also led to a more profitable company and a much more focused company and much more driven company. There's been a huge amount of positives because the focus has been on this particular project. So this has been a huge change across the organisation. It started in the UK 3.5 years ago. Because of the success that it's now delivering, the organisation is now taking it to Europe, taking it to North America, and all around the world where their sites are based. And eventually, there'll be a standard approach to use to implement this change. Although they do recognise, quite rightly so, that different cultures within different organisations, in different countries, I should say, have to be bear in mind as well. You couldn't implement the same kind of culture you have in the UK organisations in China, or the same culture you have in the UK in America, or Canada, or even in Europe. There's 295 sites, I think, across Europe, not including the UK. So it's a huge organisation, and cultures are different as well. But the important thing is that change is being driven in the right direction, and the new end state is being realised as a result of that. Okay, so I'm just going to play 2 seconds of the video. Sorry. Just so you can get a flavour of it.
Kettering sites been here since 1998. We would have started site by only reporting accidents and not looking forward. What we do very much now is looking to what we can resolve going forward rather than reacting to something that's happened. And the leadership team are really responsive to how we can improve things for the site. By us having strong communication on site and good dialogue with the employees, it makes sure that all our health and safety practices are very strong and robust.
Well, so safety. They have this daily action centre, and you can see that all of these leaders here, these are all leaders of different functions within this particular plant, are wearing headsets, and that's because all of the operators of the machines are on the headsets as well, and they're all communicating to each other across the whole of the manufacturing site. So everybody is involved in this daily meeting. Everybody has an input, particularly in the first parts of the meeting, which are related to safety, related to people, and related to performance. The rest of it is not so critical, not so important. Okay, so I just wanted just quickly to show you that. And these are some of the tools that we're using. So I'm not going to bore you with all of this. And that is pretty much it. So I haven't seen any questions come through on the chat as we've gone through today. But if there are any questions before we wrap up, please do post them. If I can't see them before we finish, I will get them later and respond to you if I can. But other than that, thank you very much for listening to me, rabbiting on for the last nearly 2 hours. It's been a pleasure to talk to you about change and to finish on the case study that we've been talking about, because it's quite passionate to me and it's quite important that we demonstrate how effective change can be within the organisation. So if there are any questions, please put them into the chat and we'll see if there are anything we can talk about.
Okay, we have to share the QR code. Just think everything's clear. Thank you for the presentation.
Okay.
It's all good, yeah. Thank you very much.
No, thank you. Yeah. Okay. No problem at all. Everybody's leaving. So no further questions. Okay. Good. All right. That's great. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
No worries. All right. You want to listen to it, are you?
Yes.
It's very difficult to